By morning, his screams echoed through the small Texas town. Maggots were crawling from a place no one could imagine, and the sheriff everyone trusted was about to be exposed. What began as a night of secret passion ended in one of the most disturbing cases this town had ever seen. A scandal so dark people still whisper about it to this day. Welcome to Dark Motives, where we uncover the darkest crimes and the stories they tried to bury. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, so you never miss another case like this. Trust me, the story you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust, love, and betrayal. And while you're at it, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Now let's step back to the night it all began. The year was 1998, and the quiet town of Abilene, Texas was a place where everyone thought they knew each other's business. At the center of it all was Sheriff Daniel Reeves, a man praised for his dedication to law and order. But behind closed doors, Reeves carried secrets darker than the cells he locked men into at night. One of those secrets was a woman named Clara Mitchell. She was 32, divorced, and often seen around town with a smile that hid her loneliness. Their affair wasn't just whispered about. It was completely hidden. No one dared to imagine that the county's top lawman could be leading such a double life. On a hot July evening, Reeves slipped away from his home, away from his wife and children, and made his way to Clara's small rented apartment on the edge of town. That night would mark the beginning of a chain of events so disturbing, the people of Abilene would talk about it for decades. Inside Clara's apartment, the air was heavy with the scent of cheap wine and cigarette smoke. Sheriff Reeves wasn't the stoic lawman people saw in public. He was restless, reckless, and obsessed with Clara. Their encounters weren't tender. They were desperate, like two people playing with fire, knowing the flames could consume them both. Every time he crossed that threshold, he risked his career, his family, and his freedom. But Reeves didn't care. The thrill was stronger than fear. For months they met in secret. Sometimes in motels off the interstate, other times in the back seat of his cruiser under the cover of night. Each meeting was more dangerous than the last, and Clara felt both exhilarated and terrified. She knew if the truth came out, she wouldn't just lose her reputation. She'd lose her life in this small town that judged quickly and forgave slowly. But what neither of them knew was that something far worse was brewing. Reeves had recently returned from a raid at an abandoned property on the outskirts of Abilene. What he didn't realize was that he had been exposed to something deadly, something that didn't reveal itself right away. Clara, unaware of the danger, welcomed him into her home that night, trusting the man in uniform who swore to protect the town. The affair became an addiction. Reeves would show up unannounced, demanding Clara's time, her body, and her silence. He told her it was love, but to her it felt more like a prison, one she couldn't escape. Yet she kept opening the door, kept letting him in, because deep down, she believed he held a power over her she couldn't break. And then came the night that changed everything, a night when Reeves pushed his obsession too far. What began as another secret rendezvous would end with horror that neither of them could have ever imagined. It was past midnight when Reeves arrived at Clara's apartment on July 18th. The streets of Abilene were quiet, the summer air thick and unmoving, but inside that dimly lit room, the tension was suffocating. Reeves had been drinking, his uniform shirt untucked, his badge hidden in his pocket as if he wanted to bury the man he was by day. Clara hesitated when she opened the door. Something about him felt different. His skin looked pale, almost clammy, and there was a faint odor she couldn't place. Still, she stepped aside and let him in. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of reckless passion. Reeves was relentless, desperate, as though this night had to mean more than the ones before. Clara noticed his breathing was heavy, uneven, and at one point she thought she saw him wince in pain. When she asked if he was all right, he brushed it off with a forced laugh, claiming the long shifts and stress of the job were catching up to him. But there was something else. As the night dragged on, Reeves kept excusing himself to the bathroom, splashing water on his face, staring at himself in the mirror like a man fighting something inside. Clara could hear him whispering, muttering words she couldn't make out. Every time he came back to her, his touch was rougher, his desperation sharper, as if he was trying to silence a storm within. By 4 a.m., exhaustion took over. Reeves collapsed onto the couch, drenched in sweat, while Clara retreated to her bedroom, uneasy but too tired to push him away. The room was quiet except for the sound of the ceiling fan and his labored breathing. That silence would not last long, because by sunrise Clara would awaken to a nightmare, one so grotesque and shocking that it would mark the beginning of a scandal unlike anything Abilene had ever seen. The first light of dawn crept through the blinds of Clara's bedroom. She woke groggy, her head pounding from the night before, but something was wrong. The sound that pulled her from sleep wasn't the hum of the ceiling fan or the chirping birds outside. It was Reeves, groaning, low and guttural as if every breath was a struggle. She hurried into the living room and froze. Reeves was sitting upright on the couch, his face pale and drenched in sweat, his shirt clinging to him like a second skin. His eyes were wide, glassy, and his hands trembled violently. Clara rushed to his side, panicked, but when he tried to speak, his words came out slurred, choked, almost incoherent. And then she saw it. Reeves doubled over, clutching himself in agony. At first she thought it was just pain, but as she leaned closer, her stomach turned. Something was moving. Tiny, writhing shapes pushed their way out, crawling against his skin. Clara screamed, stumbling backward, unable to believe what her eyes were telling her. Maggots, dozens of them, crawling, squirming, alive. They spilled from him, a grotesque tide that made her legs buckle beneath her. Reeves roared in pain, his voice echoing through the apartment walls, but no one came running. No one dared imagine the county sheriff was inside that room, living through a nightmare no man should endure. Clara wanted to run, to escape, but fear rooted her to the spot. She could only watch as the man she once believed untouchable, the lawman who had sworn to protect, became a victim of something unspeakable. The morning sun rose higher, bathing the room in light, but nothing could hide the horror of what was unfolding. Clara stood frozen, her scream still echoing in her chest, but Reeves barked at her to be quiet. His voice, usually commanding, now cracked with fear. He grabbed for his clothes, fumbling, trying to cover himself as if hiding the sight would erase what was happening. Sweat poured down his face, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely button his shirt. "No one can know," he growled, his jaw clenched tight. Clara was trembling, her back pressed against the wall. She had just witnessed the most grotesque scene of her life, yet the sheriff was more concerned about his reputation than the nightmare crawling from his body. He begged her, then threatened her, desperate to keep the truth from ever leaving that room. Clara's mind raced. If the town found out, it wouldn't just destroy Reeves. It would destroy her too. She knew how Abilene worked. Secrets spread faster than wildfire, and judgment was merciless. People would paint her as the temptress, the sinner, the reason the sheriff's life had fallen apart. That fear silenced her, even as her stomach churned with disgust. Reeves staggered into the bathroom, slamming the door shut. From inside came the sound of running water, harsh scrubbing and guttural cries. Clara pressed her hands against her ears, but the sound of his agony seeped through the walls. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, until finally the door creaked open. Reeves emerged, his face pale and hollow, a towel wrapped around his waist, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and shame. He leaned in close, his voice low and threatening. "If you ever speak a word of this, you'll regret it." Clara nodded, but inside she knew. What she had just seen could never stay buried. Not in this town. Not with a secret this dark. In the days that followed, Sheriff Reeves tried to pretend nothing had happened. He showed up to work at the courthouse, polished boots, badge gleaming on his chest, but behind the uniform was a man unraveling. His skin had grown pale, his posture slouched, and the sharp-eyed lawman the people of Abilene once admired now looked like a shadow of himself. Deputies began to notice. He disappeared into his office for hours, locked the door, and refused to answer when they knocked. At roll call, his hands shook as he held the clipboard. and sometimes in the middle of conversations, his eyes would drift, like he was fighting to keep his mind tethered to the moment. The whispers started, hushed voices in the hallways, questions no one dared ask him directly. Clara, meanwhile, lived in fear. Every time she walked past the grocery store or stepped into church on Sunday, she felt eyes burning into her. No one knew what she had seen inside that apartment, but she couldn't shake the feeling that people suspected something. Reeves had sworn her to silence, but her silence was turning into a prison, one she carried alone. At night, Reeves's suffering only grew worse. The bathroom became his battlefield. Hours of retching, groaning, and muffled curses leaked through the thin walls of his home. His wife thought it was stress, his children thought he was working too hard. But Clara knew the truth. She knew what was eating him alive, piece by piece. And in a town like Abilene, secrets never stay hidden for long. The cracks in Reeves's life were widening, and soon, the entire community would see what Clara had seen. The sheriff's perfect image crumbling under the weight of a nightmare he couldn't control. By late summer, Sheriff Reeves's decline could no longer be brushed aside. His deputies, once loyal and respectful, now traded uneasy glances during morning briefings. He had lost weight, his skin carried a sickly gray tint, and his once commanding voice now cracked with weakness. Rumors spread like wildfire across Abilene. Whispers of illness, of hidden sins, of a lawman living two lives. It was during one particularly sweltering afternoon that the first real cracks appeared in public. Reeves was standing in front of the courthouse giving a short statement about a burglary case, when suddenly he staggered. Cameras flashed, reporters gasped, and the sheriff, the man who embodied authority, collapsed to his knees. Deputies rushed to his side, trying to lift him, but witnesses swore they saw something crawling beneath his shirt before he was whisked away. The townspeople began to talk. Some believed it was stress, others whispered it was punishment for the sins they sensed but couldn't prove. And in Abilene, gossip wasn't just entertainment. It was a form of justice. Reeves had built his reputation on discipline and control, but now the same people who once shook his hand in admiration were pointing fingers, convinced the sheriff was hiding something rotten at his core. Behind the scenes, county officials were uneasy. A sheriff who couldn't stand before the public without collapsing wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a liability. Quietly, an inquiry was opened, not just into Reeves's health, but into his behavior. His late-night absences, his unexplained trips, and the whispers of a woman on the edge of town all became pieces of a puzzle no one was supposed to solve. And while Clara tried to keep her head down, she knew the noose of suspicion was tightening. Every time a deputy's car slowed near her street, her stomach twisted. Every knock at her door sent chills through her body. She wasn't just protecting Reeves's secret anymore. She was protecting her own survival. The breaking point came one late September evening inside the county jail. Reeves had insisted on finishing his shift despite his condition, but halfway through the night, he collapsed in the booking area. Deputies rushed to his aid, and in their panic, his uniform shirt was torn open. What they saw left them frozen in horror. Beneath his skin, something writhed, moving as though alive. And then, spilling from the open wound near his waistline, came the truth no one could ignore any longer. Maggots. Dozens of them sliding across the tiled floor under the harsh fluorescent lights. The room erupted in chaos. Some deputies screamed, others gagged, but all of them knew in that instant their sheriff was no longer the man they thought he was. The whispers that had haunted Abilene for months were suddenly real, undeniable, and crawling right before their eyes. Reeves, delirious and drenched in sweat, begged them to keep it quiet. He clawed at the deputies, shouting that no one could know, but the damage was done. Word spread like a brush fire. By dawn, the story was out. The sheriff was sick, cursed, or worse, and in a town where gossip carried the weight of law, that news was enough to dismantle everything Reeves had built. County officials had no choice but to act. An emergency hearing was scheduled. Reeves was placed on medical leave, stripped of his badge, and forced into seclusion. For a man who had built his entire life on authority and respect, it was a humiliation worse than death. Clara, watching from the shadows, realized her world was collapsing too. The affair, the secrecy, the terror, all of it was circling back to her doorstep. And yet, even as Reeves's condition worsened, even as doctors and investigators tried to piece together the source of his affliction, one question remained unanswered. How had it started? The truth, when it finally surfaced, would shock even the most hardened hearts in Abilene. Sheriff Daniel Reeves never returned to his badge. Within weeks of his exposure, he disappeared from the public eye, hidden away in a state hospital where records remain sealed to this day. Officially, the county labeled his downfall as a medical emergency, but the people of Abilene knew better. They had seen the maggots, they had heard the screams, and they had watched their lawman collapse in front of them. For a town that trusted him to uphold justice, the truth was more haunting than any crime they had ever witnessed. Clara Mitchell, the woman at the center of his secret life, left Abilene shortly after. Neighbors recalled how she moved in the dead of night, her apartment stripped bare within hours, as if she was fleeing a curse. Some say she settled in another state. Others believe she carried the weight of that night with her forever. But no one in Abilene ever saw her again. The case of Sheriff Reeves became less about the man and more about the warning it carried. Power can hide secrets. Authority can disguise sickness. But eventually, the truth crawls its way out, no matter how deep you try to bury it. And in this town, the truth was unforgettable. If this story gripped you the way it gripped Abilene, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another case like this. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Your voice keeps this channel alive, and your support means more than you know. This has been Dark Motives. Thank you for watching, and remember, evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it wears a badge.